Hello, my name is Anessa, Professor Anessa Kimball. I am co-director of security for the Canadian Defence and Security Network. I am also director of the Centre for International Security at the École Supérieure d'études internationales at University Laval. I am here to share with you a short presentation about data collection, in particular, a data collection set that I started many years ago on Canadian defense and security agreements. I've been collecting agreements that are in force and also expired agreements since 1955, and with the goal of producing a data set. So first, when we talk about creating a data set, this is previous to thinking about the analysis. When we're thinking about conceptualizing or measuring our theoretical concepts, there is reflection that is to be done about what are the types of information that one might look for, how should we extract this information from the primary documents, and then if we want to do quantitative analysis with that information, we have to also code that information into a meaningful context. So as you can see, the data creation process has these phases. The first phase is identifying and locating the texts or the agreements, the corpus of documentation that you are going to use. The next part is extracting the qualitative data based on a framework. I have applied a questionnaire, and then finally take that qualitative data and put it into numeric codes, which would be associated with the information. And so first off, we can start with a very general question. Why would we study informal defense and security agreements? My first article on this project was published in 2017. In that article, I make the case for studying these agreements because, after all, these are legal agreements. They are binding. What is interesting is that these are not formal treaties. And by formal treaties, it means that that agreement will have gone before a legislative body for approval. These are agreements that the legislature generally gets notified about, but they actually have no active role in approving the agreement or in ratifying the agreement. So one thing that is interesting is that these agreements permit, they actually exclude certain veto players from the game. And as such, they can be an important tool for executives. In fact, when it comes to defense and security, we already know that the executive has a large level of discretion in this area. And so the use of these agreements, in particular, the fact that the executive can mandate a foreign minister or a defense minister to negotiate the agreement and sign on behalf of the government, in a smaller context, means that these agreements can be much more quick. They can also be more secret, but it doesn't mean that they produce projects that are any less large. For example, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, is developed out of one of these agreements. And in fact, I have a book chapter in 2018 that talks about how Canada, how they went about eternalizing NORAD in perpetuity. And so what has been learned so far, and so we study informal defense and security agreements to try to understand how states link themselves in ways that are less formalized, and to also understand if the design of these agreements, if the institutional design of these agreements actually addresses the strategic problems, the underlying strategic problems, and how states design these agreements to be flexible and adaptable. Those are some of the things that I've been interested in the project. And so the project so far has identified almost 500 agreements, starting from the US-Canada pair and then going on from there. And so this project itself has been going along in phases. what has been learned from the project? So currently this project has 4 different publications associated with it, things that have been learned from the quantitative analysis, for example. The quantitative analysis shows that things such as internal political instability, such as cabinet reshuffles, tend to be linked to less institutionalized agreements. Democratic presidents, in fact, joint liberal leadership, that is to say, liberal leadership in both the United States and Canada, is associated with more institutionalized agreements. And of course, as our classic kind of IR theories would tell us, increases in shared threats by a pair of states also tend to increase the legalization of these agreements. And also the case study, which I completed at NORAD, field work was done in 2014, and I was hosted at Carleton NIPSIA. In the case study work, I managed to interview defense decision makers that were associated with NORAD renewals to talk to the bargainers about exactly how these adaptations and modifications came about to the agreement. And for instance, how Canada managed to keep NORAD relevant by consenting to a BMD consultation amendment to the agreement, for example. And from here, the project is headed in a couple of directions. First off, the project will provide a publicly available archive of the agreements. And so future scholars that are interested in any of these agreements will be able to go to the archive, its searchable database, and say, okay, I would like to study, military assistance. And so then it will drop out every agreement and give you all the agreements on military assistance. And so again, it is a resource for future scholars to look at specific comparative sets of agreements or look at the larger portion altogether. It will also include the data itself as it is drawn from the agreements. And so, for example, here we have an agreement. Here we have the coding sheet for the agreements. And so you can see this is actually the 1958 agreement between Canada and the United States under the Committee of Joint Defense. And the coding sheet itself, it depends on the length of the agreement, but as you can see, the coding sheet includes all of the information about the details of the agreement. And then it asks various questions. And so, for example, question number 23 is describe the goals, motives of the agreement. And so you see here, this is drawn directly from the agreement. And then I also include how I coded it based on the numeric codes. So for example, I coded it as 6, meaning new institution, and 3, meaning collaboration. And so when we go to the numeric coding sheet, we find that if we go to question number 23, here we are. What is the goal? 23, technological improvement. 1, extension, exchange of information. So 3 and 6, purchase of goods. And you can see how this coding sheet allows me to identify various actors associated with the agreement. A lot of the questions are simple yes/no questions, but also some of the questions ask for greater details. So for example, one of the things that we might be interested in is how agreements fall apart, right? And so one of the, there are several questions that are basically about how did the agreement terminate itself? So was it caused by renegotiation, change in political status, change in external conditions, policy dispute, military conflict? And so these are all ways in which I can comparatively look at agreements to see which agreements, what's the most common source of agreements falling apart. And so again, what you can see is that this project will offer multiple levels and types of information that for scholars to look at and to build from. And so as we go back to the PowerPoint, there are more cases of non-treaty defense and security cooperation than bilateral or multilateral treaties in the world. For example, the Alliance Treaty Obligations and Provisions data contain 386 bilateral treaties, and this is an improvement upon the Coalitive War Alliance data. And so this data will offer at least 500 cases. It is designed around the Institutional Design Research Program that Leeds and Cormenos are most associated with. And as I said, each case will have an original agreement text, the completed questionnaire, and then the cross-referencing in the data set itself, coding all of the aspects. And so you see here, these are some of the, what you see on the left are, when I created the index of institutionalization, these are the questions specifically I looked to in order to code that index. And so you see that there are very specific things that we would link with how institutionalized an agreement is. For example, are there mediation and arbitration? Is there economic aid? Does this require cross-bureaucratic coordination within states or between states? What about what role of the military? And so again, by pulling out this information from many, many agreements, we can learn about how those agreements are designed on average. And in fact, as I have started to do the research, I see that there is actually a playbook that is deployed by the United States. And I have research, I have an article in European Politics and Society about NATO and EU enlargement, focusing on the role of these agreements, particularly with the US. And so to give you an idea about what this research program looks like, I would say I started working on this research when I got to Canada, so now we're 15 years in. I have about 72% of the agreements are collected in my hands. I indicate here the publications associated with this research program. The first one was the Canada-US slice. I have a forthcoming publication in Journal of Transatlantic Studies about the Canada-US versus US transatlantic with NATO partners, in which I show that there's actually a difference in the level of depth between how the US and Canada cooperate versus how the US cooperates with other partners. And so when it comes to the collection of the agreements, the collection and the archiving, both around 72% complete. The data extraction, of course, that is taking much longer. That is, I'm about 36% complete there, and the coding continues after the extraction. And so in the end, there's going to be a user-friendly database. There will be an R package, I hope, and a Stata data package as final sets, so that researchers can basically pull this data into other data sets that they are creating easier. And so to give you an idea of what institutionalization looks like, here is the legalization level of the agreements between the United States and Canada. And what I did is I basically just identified some agreements to give you an idea about what this looks like. And so, for example, you see the 2002 agreement on the Joint Strike Fighter with highly institutionalized, as was the 94 counterterrorism agreement, but some agreements are much less legalized. For example, the agreement establishing NORAD was not highly legalized. It was actually middle of the road, but what we see out of it now is an institution that exists and that has a strong identity. When I compared the transatlantic versus US Canadian, what I did was basically I had 80 agreements, 80 some agreements of US and Canada. So I drew a random sample of those 80 agreements and coded them and tested them. And one of the things that is clear is that we see again that there's quite a bit of variety of the agreements. There's a bit of clustering here in the early 50s, and I think that was just an artifact of the agreements I had available. Probably if I repulled this again, it would be far more distributed across time. But we also see that there is actually a difference in the level of legalization on average. You can see that there are far more squares above the line of 20, right, than there are triangles. And so there is something distinctly different about the level of legalization that the US and Canada designed together. And so as I said, this is a project that has gone, it covers multiple phases. And so the phase one was actually supported by the new faculty research grant at University of Laval. And here I list the students that had trained on it. Phase two was the NORAD institutional study, which I undertook in Ottawa in 2014. And phase three, which has been since the awarding of the CDSN grant in 2019, has been to continue the data. And so you can see that I have hired multiple students as well. So at least 8 graduate students have trained on this project specifically, and there will be more graduate students to train as well. I still have agreements to locate, and of course, the data extraction needs to be done. The first step is identifying the agreements, and the next step is the data extraction. And so to give you an idea of the agreements that I currently have for data extraction, I have around 100 and some agreements that are currently ready for data extraction between the US and Canada, and between Canada and other states. And so this includes the agreements with Brazil and African states and European states that were located by student researchers. And so what we know here are some of the things that have been, some of the hypotheses that have been supported by this research. So like I said, shared rivals, liberal leaders, cabinet instability. In fact, the size of the effects indicates that domestic influences are more important than external threats when it comes to US and Canadian defense and security agreement institutionalization. And I think that this is an important point that that does deserve greater study in depth. Of course, as you can see, this project has been very, very long going. And so I also learned that you have to have, if you want to do a massive quantitative data collections, that you need to have consistent financial and moral support. You need to create a team. When you see these large data sets and you see that they are co-authored, it is because it requires multiple people to keep that fire burning, to keep collecting the data. And so one of the challenges here essentially is that there are not very many quantitative international security and defense scholars in Canada. And so what that means is that, this is a community that I'm very much trying to build from not much. In fact, evidence is offered from multiple sources in a manuscript that I wrote because of this project, called Quantitative International Security Studies in Canada, the Collective Public Good of Diverse Knowledge in the IR Community. I think that I sent a version of this manuscript as well. So I hope there are some of you find some interest in that. In fact, This data set is one of only 2 data sets that specifically is on Canadian defense and security research objects. The other data set being a data set collected by Erica Chenoweth on Canadian counterterrorism policies. And so the next steps for the program overall was, offer this public knowledge good that is an archive for future scholars. This research is also being rolled into a book project that I am working on called Beyond 2% NATO Partners Institution and Burden Management Concepts, Risks, and Models. There is also another manuscript that I'm preparing talking about specifically ballistic missile defense, strategic defense, and NORAD. The data, once completed and available, will offer many, many options for comparative agreement subsets. For example, you can examine just procurement, you can examine classified information, intelligence sharing, nuclear energy for defense, peaceful purposes, training of forces. And so again, this asset itself will permit comparative study, also qualitative study, because you will have the agreements available to you. You don't have to go to the UN or Hein online, because I have done that. My team has done that. While also giving you the data if you want to do the quantitative research analysis, or if you want to do quantitative descriptive analysis. And so again, these data themselves are going to be multifaceted and will hopefully provide a solid good for future scholars. And so thank you very much for listening to me today. You have here the set of publications, should you have interest. And if you have comments or questions, I would be happy to receive them by emails. And of course, I would ask you to direct any complaints to Steve. And so thank you very much. And I hope you enjoy the Summer Institute.